On January 30th of this year, Utah Against Police Brutality sat in Mayor Biskupski's office and demanded a draft to a city policy that would outline the handling and the release of police body camera footage. After reading, analyzing, and discussing the draft policy, UAPB has come to the determination that the version of the draft presented to us is unacceptable. It seems to us as though this document had been written without forethought and with very little to no insight, nor consideration for the issues at hand. This policy does not demand a culture of accountability or transparency from the police department, which was the pretext for the incorporation of body cameras to begin with, and the needlessly obscure language of this document is an avalanche of qualifications and contingencies. The draft policy, as it is now written, would thwart community control and civilian participation, and would increasingly consolidate the monopolistic control of information protecting police and governing agencies, and will only serve to further disempower the people. We, as Utah Against Police Brutality, reject all language and mechanisms encoded in the draft policy and demand a straightforward policy that will allow for increased transparency between community members and police agencies, and which will empower the people to hold the police accountable when they exceed their mandate to protect and serve. This policy is a continuation of the narrative currently promoted by police agencies and politicians nationwide, portraying police as a targeted and at-risk population. It does not address the increasingly violent actions of police forces or the further encroachment upon and erosion of the people's freedoms and dignity. The draft policy is not in the best interest of the city, and especially not in the best interest of our most marginalized communities, which are the poor, Black, Indigenous, Chicano, and immigrant people of color, predominantly impacted by police brutality. Again, the body camera was fundamentally presented to the public to serve as a check against the entrenched offices of city, the police force, and district attorney's office. It was presented as a step towards increasing the transparency and accountability of police agencies. And yet, the policy as written would allow footage of officer-involved critical incidents to be withheld from the public for up to 180 days. Body camera footage belongs to the people, and they should be allowed to apprise it immediately, not 6 months later. We can only deduce that this aspect of the policy is an underhanded attempt by public officials to allow for the atrophy of public concern in specific officer-involved critical incidents. Additionally, the caveats through which footage can be withheld from the public indicate that the mayor's office is passing the buck of responsibility onto other hands. The blame and burden is shifted from the mayor's office to the district attorney's office or to outside investigating agencies, in order to prevent the footage from coming forward under the flimsy, unsubstantiated, and wholly localized justification of not being able to obtain due process or a fair trial. DA Sim Gill has publicly stated that he would refuse to prosecute a case in which the body camera footage is released by the city or by the police, meaning that if this policy were in place, it would essentially create a precedent in which footage could be unjustly withheld for 180 days from the public. Moreover, the language we find in the draft would allow for a compromised version of the body camera videos to be made public, as opposed to an undoctored, more honest video. If redactions are allowed to be made on the footage before it is released to the public, there can be no transparency. If officers are allowed to review the footage, not only before the public, but also before making their own statement, how can our community ever expect the truth of an incident to come to light? Through community action group meetings hosted by the city, we are being told that the police department, the mayor's office, and other bureaucratic forces are working with the community to solve the problem of police brutality in Salt Lake City. UAPB views this draft document to be a meager attempt by the mayor's office at pacification, as the latter continues to make empty promises of change, and its draft exposes underlying motivations of self-preservation, avoiding responsibility, and honoring the status quo. UAPB finds this wholly unacceptable, and we demand change now. We do not have the adequate time that is necessary to address the extensive list of criticisms that UAPB has with this draft policy. Notwithstanding, we can sum it up by saying that we reject this policy, and we demand one that is written for the benefit of the people. Our demands are as follows. Firstly, we demand that footage from an officer-involved critical incident be made public within 24 to 48 hours following the OICI event. Secondly, once the footage from an OICI event is released, we demand that it be released in its entirety and that it is in no way edited, redacted, or compromised. Aside from protecting the victim or victims or vulnerable populations recorded within the video, there is absolutely no justifiable reason to redact the footage. Finally, we demand that the mechanisms included within the policy must be accessible and readily understandable to the people of Salt Lake City. If truth, transparency, accountability to community, and justice for the victims of police overreach and violence were the true goal, this draft policy would not need to be so misleading and fraught with doublespeak. What Utah Against Police Brutality demands in a final version of this policy is by no means unprecedented. In fact, there are other cities and a plethora of examples our organization could cite as basic guidelines for a policy which Salt Lake City should adopt. We have seen body cam footage made public in other cities within the first 24 to 48 hours following officer-involved critical incidents. In New York City, Mayor de Blasio has been very adamant that the public deserves full transparency into its police force and has made it clear that there is no reason to withhold body camera footage for a period of time longer than 48 hours. Yet time and time again, the Salt Lake City Mayor's office demonstrates that their main concern is to protect its police department, and in so doing, that we as civilians are incapable of checking police power. UAPB has been working diligently for years to create a strong, transparent, people-centered method through which the police would be held accountable by the people of Salt Lake City. Through the implementation of a Civilian Police Accountability Council, justice for the predominantly poor and people of color victims of police misconduct would finally be reachable through the direct participation of the people and through police force transparency. Salt Lake City's current Civilian Review Board does not actually give the community any power. We have already seen examples of how a community can be given more control in its involvement with the forces that serve them. In Chicago, the Chicago Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression has proposed the Civilian Police Accountability Council, which would be a democratically elected council with the ability to investigate all complaints, police shootings, misconduct, and violations of the Constitution and the people's civil rights. As an organization and as a community, our clear demands that Mayor Biskupski's office rewrite this fully unacceptable draft policy are neither unprecedented nor unprincipled. We will not take no for an answer, and we will not stop fighting until we have achieved what we have set out to do. The people's footage is not for you to bargain with, Mayor. End police brutality in our city, Black Lives Matter. Community control now.